Hello, my dear, wonderful listeners from all over the world. I am endlessly grateful that you are here with me again. Every time I read your comments, your stories, and the cities you come from, I feel that we are becoming one big, incredibly important family. Today I am going to tell you an extraordinary story. A story that began in the most ordinary housing estate in Manchester, in a grey, concrete tower block from the 1970s. But, as is so often the case, it is behind these faceless, peeling facades that secrets are hidden. Secrets that can either shatter a life completely or, on the contrary, become the beginning of healing for many people. Before we dive headfirst into this narrative, I want to speak to you personally. You are my main strength, my inspiration, and the reason I get up in the morning and turn on the microphone. Please take a moment and write in the comments which corner of the world you are listening from. It is always incredibly important to me to know who is with me today. Perhaps you are listening to me in bustling London, where the air smells of petrol and the energy of millions. Or maybe your voice comes from romantic Edinburgh, where the wind from the Firth of Forth carries the scent of freedom and history. Or perhaps you are in distant, mysterious Bristol, where the sound of the Severn estuary can be heard. Or in Liverpool, where the Mersey flows majestically. Your presence here, in this very moment, makes every story alive and real. Thank you for that. And now, let us begin. Make yourselves comfortable, because the journey we are about to take together will be long, difficult, full of tears and pain, but incredibly important and cleansing. It was a cold October evening. The wind, cutting to the bone, drove withered leaves across the empty courtyard, leaves that had fallen from the branches of old poplars, planted here back in the post-war era.
The sky over Manchester was covered with heavy, leaden clouds, promising either a long, persistent rain that could sometimes pour for 3 days without stopping, or the first snow, which, as if out of spite, refused to fall, making people feel the approaching winter even more keenly. In the stairwell, it smelled of dampness, mustiness, cheap washing powder that the neighbors used in the communal laundries, and someone's fried fish with garlic. This smell seemed to have soaked into the walls, into the old wooden banisters, and into the very memory of this old building, once built for factory workers. Margaret Wilson, a woman of 68, struggled up the stairs to her flat on the 5th floor. Each step sent a dull, throbbing pain through her knees, which, after a long and hard life, reminded her of themselves with increasing persistence, turning every climb into a real ordeal. In her right hand, she carried a heavy plastic bag of shopping. A loaf of bread she had bought at the corner bakery, a liter of kefir for her stomach, a packet of buckwheat, and a cheap piece of sausage she had bought on offer at the supermarket because her pension, which arrived on the 12th of every month, had been particularly meager this month. In her other hand, she clutched an old, worn wooden walking stick without which she could no longer manage, especially when climbing to the 5th floor. She stopped on the 2nd floor landing to catch her breath. Her heart was pounding in her throat, and cold sweat was running down her back despite the cool autumn air. At that moment, she heard voices coming from the half-open door of the flat on the left. Margaret recognized them instantly. It was Helen, her eternal neighbor, a woman of about 65, known throughout the building for her razor-sharp tongue and her unhealthy love of gossip. Next to her stood Dorothy, her faithful friend and ally, also a gossip, but somewhat more restrained. They stood in the doorway, smoking, ignoring the ban, even though a sign saying "no smoking" hung right above their heads. They did not see Margaret, who stood in the half-darkness of the stairwell. Margaret froze. She did not want to attract attention to herself, did not want to start the day with gossip. "Just look at her," Helen hissed, blowing smoke towards the stairs. "Always carrying those heavy bags, as if she had gold in them. And always alone. No husband, no children, no grandchildren. Always grumpy, never says hello first. No one visits her, She never goes anywhere. I wonder what she does in that flat of hers. Probably tortures cats, given the smell of mustiness and old age coming from her. I heard she used to be a doctor. But who would fire a doctor? She must have messed something up and is hiding now. Margaret froze. These words pierced her like tiny shards of glass. She had heard them dozens, hundreds of times over the past 20 years. Furtive glances, whispers behind her back, open malice when one of the neighbors saw her stumble on the stairs. She had learned not to pay attention. She had learned to let these words wash over her. But at that moment, something inside her stirred. The weariness that had accumulated over long years of loneliness and voluntary isolation, mixed with a deep resentment that suddenly surfaced. She could have answered. She could have stepped out of the shadows and put these women in their place, told them that her resignation had been her own decision, that she had left not because she was a bad doctor, but because she could no longer bear the pain she saw every day. But she did not. She was too tired for arguments. She simply continued climbing slowly, trying not to make a sound, leaning heavily on her stick. When she reached her floor, Margaret struggled with the lock for a long time. Her hands were trembling with exertion, and the key would not find the keyhole. Finally, the heavy iron door, covered with layers of old paint, gave way, and she stepped into her flat. She was greeted by the familiar, painful silence and the smell of old books that stood on the shelves along the walls. On the windowsill, in the most prominent place, stood a cactus. It was already 23 years old. Margaret had grown it from a tiny cutting she had brought from the hospital, and over the years it had become her only living companion, the sole witness to her silent days and sleepless nights. She talked to it when she felt particularly lonely, watered it on schedule, and even wiped its spines with a damp cloth. She put the heavy bag on the kitchen table, which was covered with an old faded oilcloth, and went to the window. The courtyard below was empty and lifeless. Only a stray dog, thin and mangy, with its tail between its legs, was sniffing around the dustbins, looking for something to eat. In the block opposite, across the street, lights were coming on in the windows. In each of them, a stranger's life flickered. A stranger's family, stranger's dinners, stranger's laughter, drifting through the closed windows. Margaret sighed and turned away. Her gaze fell on the old sideboard, behind whose dusty glass stood the only photograph in a simple wooden frame. It showed a young woman in a snow-white coat, with a confident look and a slight smile, and next to her, a group of children in hospital pajamas. The photograph was over 30 years old. Margaret went to the sideboard and ran her finger over the glass, wiping away the invisible dust. That was her life, her world, her work, what she had once fled from, like a cowardly soldier from the battlefield. 20 years ago, Margaret Wilson had been the head of pediatric surgery at one of the largest hospitals in Manchester Royal Infirmary. She had been a brilliant surgeon, saving lives, operating on the most seriously ill patients, spending 12 hours a day in the operating theater. Her hands, which now trembled with age and illness, had once held a scalpel with the confidence and precision of a god. She knew what the inside of a child's body looked like, knew where every bone, every blood vessel, every nerve was. She could stitch a ruptured spleen, set complex fractures, and stop internal bleeding when other doctors had already given up. But she also knew what pain looked like. She saw children with fractures that could not have been the result of a simple fall from a bicycle or from playing on the playground. She saw burns that had appeared for strange, inexplicable reasons, which mothers explained as an awkward movement with an iron or a knocked-over kettle. She saw bruises and hematomas whose shape screamed that they had been inflicted by adult hands. And she saw eyes, empty, indifferent, dead eyes of children in whom fear had become so everyday and ordinary that they had forgotten how to cry, forgotten how to ask for help. Every day, she fought for the lives of her young patients. But she also fought against the system, against social services, which believed the parents and turned a blind eye to obvious things. Against the police, who did not want to interfere in family matters, considering them the private business of citizens. Against the Crown Prosecution Service, for which there was a lack of ironclad, indisputable evidence. She wrote countless reports and memos, called social workers to her office, demanded checks and re-examinations. But in return, she received only empty letters, bureaucratic excuses, and promises that the matter would be investigated and that appropriate measures would be taken shortly. She saw how the children she had healed and restored to health returned to her ward again and again, and each time the injuries were more severe and the chances of survival lower. One day, she could not take it anymore. It was an 8-year-old girl named Emily. She was brought to the ward with multiple injuries, internal bleeding, and a ruptured spleen. Margaret operated on her for 6 hours, literally pulling her back from the brink of death, piecing her back together. Emily survived, recovering slowly but surely. And then social services decided that conditions in her family had improved, that the parents had repented and reformed. They sent the girl home. Margaret wrote protests, demanded a review of the case, but it was all in vain. 6 months later, Emily was admitted again. Unconscious, with a ruptured spleen, with internal bleeding. Margaret operated again, but it was too late. The girl died on the operating table, never regaining consciousness. She died because the system could not be broken, because her voice, the voice of a doctor who saw the truth, meant nothing in this bureaucratic hell. Margaret left the operating theater, pulled off her bloody gloves, and burned them in the ashtray. She sat down in her office, looked at the pile of patient files on her desk, and wrote her resignation. She could no longer bear to watch this injustice. She could not be the one who treated the consequences without having the strength to prevent the causes. She retreated into silence, into isolation, into voluntary exile. She swore to herself that she would never again feel this helplessness. And now, 2 decades later, sitting in her small, cold flat, she felt the past returning. It did not come in the form of nightmares, which had tormented her in the first years, or in the form of painful memories from which she had fled into work and then into loneliness. It came in the form of a child's crying, which she had heard a few minutes earlier, standing on the 4th floor. That crying, soft, exhausted, hopeless, penetrated the old thin walls and touched something deep within her, something she thought was dead and buried forever. She did not know who lived in the flat 1 floor below. She barely kept in touch with the neighbors, preferring to remain in the shadows and not draw attention to herself. But she knew that a young woman with a small child lived there. Sometimes she heard the patter of little feet on the stairs, sometimes a loud male voice, muffled by the distance and the concrete ceilings. But most of the time, silence came from that flat. A heavy, disturbing, sticky silence that said more than any words. It was similar to the silence in her own flat, but she felt that something menacing lay behind it. That night, Margaret could not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark, staring at the whitewashed ceiling, listening to the ticking of the old wall clock on the other side of the wall, and thinking about that crying. She could not get it out of her head. She imagined a little boy, thin, pale, with huge, frightened eyes. A boy whom no one hears, a boy whose pain was his only companion. She imagined him sitting in the corner of his room, arms wrapped around his knees, crying so quietly that no one could hear him, because if they heard him, it would be even worse. She knew she had to do something, but fear, the old, sticky, paralyzing fear, gripped her body and her will. She was afraid that Emily's story would repeat itself, afraid that she would again be powerless against the system, afraid that her intervention would only make things worse, that she would harm the very person she was trying to save. And she prayed, not knowing to whom, that it was just an accident, that tomorrow everything would be different, that the crying would stop on its own. But the next day was worse.
much worse. Margaret woke to a shrill, piercing sound that tore the silence of her flat like a knife through silk. She sat bolt upright, her heart racing like a wild animal in a cage. For a few seconds, she could not understand where she was or what was happening. Her eyes widened and stared into the darkness, trying to orient themselves. And then the sound repeated itself. It was a scream. Not a child's cry, not the hysterical scream of a woman, but a scream, deep, male, full of rage and fury. And then a woman's voice, shrieking with terror, desperate and piercing. "An ambulance! Someone call an ambulance! Quick, for God's sake!" Margaret leapt out of bed, forgetting the pain in her knees and back. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning. Outside it was still dark, grey and dreary. She threw on an old, threadbare dressing gown that hung on the back of a chair, and without doing it up, ran out onto the landing. The cold air of the stairwell hit her lungs. Downstairs, on the 4th floor, residents were already gathering. Some stood in the doorways of their flats. Some leaned out of the windows, trying to understand what was happening. There were worried voices, murmuring, the sound of feet. Margaret, breathing heavily, went down a few steps and stopped dead. She saw the wide open door of flat number 42, and what lay on the floor just inside the threshold. A child. A little boy, about 5 years old, at first glance very thin and pale, with thin wrists and unnaturally large eyes that were now closed. He lay awkwardly, his arms outstretched, and did not move. His head was turned to one side, and beneath it a dark stain was slowly spreading. Next to him, right by the wall, lay a single slipper. The other was still on his foot, but twisted. His face was deathly pale, and there were deep black rings under his eyes that could not have appeared overnight. Margaret felt the ground give way beneath her feet, felt the world narrow to this terrible, motionless figure on the concrete floor. She recognized him. It was the same boy whose soft, broken crying she had heard the previous evening. James. She did not know his full name, but she remembered his face from when he had once passed her on the stairs, head down, eyes fixed on the floor. Next to the body, her back against the cold, peeling wall, stood a woman. Catherine, the mother. A young woman, about 28 years old, with disheveled, matted hair and an empty, glazed expression. She stared at one point, seeing no one around her, and rocked back and forth, pressing her hands to her chest, as if trying to hold her own heart, which was about to jump out. She looked like a broken doll, a person who had lost more than just her mind. Her face was white as a sheet, and on it was an expression that Margaret knew only too well. It was not fear for the child. It was fear for herself. Animal. Primal fear that makes people do terrible things. Margaret could not remember how she got to the boy. Her legs moved of their own accord, as if in a fog, as if in a terrible dream from which one cannot wake. The people parted before her, and in their eyes she saw surprise, curiosity, and even fear. But she paid them no attention. She fell to her knees beside James and, forgetting the pain in her joints, which cracked loudly, grabbed his wrist, feeling for a pulse. Her old trembling fingers slid over the cold skin. The seconds stretched into eternity. The pulse, weak, thready, barely perceptible, like the flutter of a butterfly's wings, but it was there. He was breathing, barely noticeably. "He's alive," she said loudly, but her voice sounded calm, almost composed, although inside she was trembling with tension. "He's alive, but he needs immediate help. Quickly!" Margaret acted on autopilot, like a well-oiled machine. She lifted the boy's eyelid, checked the pupil's reaction to the light coming through the half-open door. The pupil reacted, but slowly, very slowly. Concussion. Definitely concussion. She examined his head and saw a huge purple-blue bruise on his left temple, already swelling and rapidly growing larger.
The hematoma was growing before her eyes. The shape of the bruise was irregular, unnatural. It could not have come from a fall out of bed, as the mother claimed. The bruise was deep, intense. It was coming from within, indicating significant internal bleeding. Then she noticed old, already healing scratches on his wrists, a week or two old, and a barely visible red mark on his thin, childish neck, resembling the trace of coarse, strong fingers that had squeezed his throat. "Everyone step back!" she commanded in an authoritative, sharp voice that brooked no contradiction, and which she had not used in 20 years, but which she knew as well as her own breath. "Don't touch him, don't move him, don't turn him over. I need ice, quickly, a clean towel, now." Her voice was like a whip crack, and the neighbors, who just a minute before had been standing frozen, began to stare. Helen, the same one who had gossiped on the stairs yesterday, jumped in surprise and ran into her flat to get ice, stamping her feet loudly. Someone ran to get a towel. Margaret turned to Catherine. She looked the young woman straight in the eyes, and there was so much steel in her gaze that Catherine involuntarily looked away. "How did this happen?" Margaret asked, her voice cold as ice. "How did this happen?" Catherine stammered, managing only a whisper. "He fell out of bed," she whispered, not looking at Margaret. "He just fell. I was in the kitchen. I didn't see it. He falls often. He's so clumsy." Margaret knew it was a lie. She knew what children who fall out of bed look like. Usually, they have grazes on their elbows and knees, sometimes small bruises on their foreheads, but not an injury like this. James had an injury to his temple, a specific place that requires a strong, targeted blow. It was the mark of an impact against a hard edge, or of a brutal, strong hand that had slammed his head against a wall or piece of furniture. But she said nothing. Now was not the time for accusations and explanations. Now was the time to save the child, to fight for every second, for every beat of his weak heart. She took the ice that Helen had handed her in a bag from some frozen dumplings, wrapped it in a clean towel, and with surgical precision placed it on the boy's temple. James flinched slightly, his lips parted, and a weak, barely audible sigh escaped them. His eyes opened. They were cloudy, confused, without awareness, only with dull, diffuse pain. He looked at Margaret, and there was so much fear in his gaze that it broke her heart. "Mommy," he whispered so softly that she barely heard it. "Mommy, I didn't mean to. I won't do it again. I didn't mean to." Margaret heard these words. She knew them only too well. Children living in hell always say, "I didn't mean to." They take the cruelty of others as their own fault, as punishment for existing. They apologize for being beaten, for crying, for breathing. Margaret clenched her teeth to keep from screaming with rage. She took the boy's hand in hers, warming it. "Hush, hush, my dear," she whispered. "Lie still, don't move. The doctors will be here soon. They'll help you. Everything will be all right, do you hear?" Catherine turned away. She did not go to her son. She did not take his hand. She did not say a single comforting word. She stood against the wall, pressed against it like a trapped animal, and said nothing. Her eyes were empty. No tears, no compassion, only dull, animal despair. In that moment, Margaret saw what she had been trying to ignore for 20 years. She saw the vicious circle that never closes. Fear, violence, silence. And she understood that she could no longer be part of this silence. She could no longer stand by and watch another life shatter before her eyes. After 12 minutes, which felt like an eternity, the ambulance arrived, its siren wailing in the courtyard and bringing all the neighbors out onto their balconies to see what was happening. Margaret explained the child's condition to the paramedic briefly and concisely. Pulse, pupil reaction, likely time of loss of consciousness, nature of the injury.
She spoke in the professional matter-of-fact language she had not used in 20 years, but which she knew as well as her own name and date of birth. She used terms that a layman would not understand, but which mean everything to a doctor. The paramedic, a young man with a tired face, looked at her in amazement, but said nothing, just nodded and began to act according to her instructions. As the stretcher with little James was carried down the stairs, Margaret remained on the landing. She felt the eyes of the neighbors on her, whispering behind her back. Helen was whispering something to her friend Dorothy again, casting curious, appraising glances at Margaret. Margaret caught only a snippet of a sentence. Where does she know all this from? She's old and sick, but she talks like a real doctor. Margaret turned to Catherine, who was still standing against the wall. Aren't you going with him? She asked, and there was barely contained anger in her voice. I have to call my husband, Catherine replied without looking up. He needs to know. Your son needs his mother, not a phone call to your husband. Margaret cut her off sharply. He's in the ambulance now, unconscious and frightened. Go with him and stay with him until he comes round. Catherine finally looked up at her. There was anger in her eyes, mixed with despair, shame, and animal fear. It was the look of a person who had long since reached a dead end, and saw no way out, who had grown accustomed to living in fear, and had forgotten how to feel anything else. And what do you know about what he needs? She hissed, almost spitting the words out. You sit in your hole like an old mouse, have nothing to do with anyone, and you tell me how to live. Go back to your flat and stay out of my life. Margaret did not answer. She looked at Catherine, and there was so much compassion and pain in her gaze that the young woman could not bear it, and looked away. Margaret turned and walked heavily up the stairs to her flat, feeling with each step a cold, pure anger rising within her. An anger that she had buried so deep that she had almost forgotten it existed. An anger that was stronger than pain, stronger than fear, stronger than weariness. In her flat, she stood for a long time at the window, watching the ambulance with its flashing lights drive out of the courtyard, scattering sleepy passers-by. Her hands were trembling, but it was not weakness. It was anger, cold, pure, unyielding anger that demanded action. Margaret went to the table where her old notebook lay. The leather cover was worn at the creases. The yellowed pages were covered with small, careful handwriting, with names, telephone numbers, addresses of people long since dead. She opened it, turned over many pages, written over decades, and found the right number. David Thompson, her former registrar, who had once worked under her at the hospital. He had been young, full of enthusiasm, optimism, and the belief that everyone could be saved. He had believed that justice existed, and that if you just tried your hardest, the world would change for the better. She had not called him for almost 15 years, since she had left the hospital and broken off all contact. But she knew that he was now the head of pediatric surgery at one of the largest hospitals in Manchester, and that he still remembered his oaths. She dialed the number she knew by heart, and after the fourth long ring, she heard his sleepy voice. Hello? David, it's Margaret, she said, and her voice trembled, but she pulled herself together. I need your help, urgently. There was a long, heavy, memory-laden silence on the other end of the line. Margaret? He asked, incredulous. My God, Margaret Wilson? Is it really you? How many years has it been? I thought you'd left Manchester, disappeared somewhere in the countryside. What's happened? Margaret briefly, succinctly, without unnecessary emotion, described the situation. She told him about the boy, about his serious injury, about her professional suspicion that it was not a simple fall from a bed. She spoke dryly and matter-of-factly, as at a medical conference. David listened in silence, occasionally asking short, clarifying questions, like a good student who knows what is expected of him. I'll be at the hospital in an hour, he said finally. I'll find out what's going on with him and do everything I can. Margaret, I'm glad you called. Very, very glad. We've missed you. You're needed in this city. Margaret put the phone down and went to the old, worn-out wardrobe that stood in the corner of the bedroom. On the top shelf, under a pile of old, faded sheets, lay a cardboard box tied with string. She took it out, blew off the thick layer of dust that had accumulated over the years, and opened it. Inside were documents, certificates of honor, letters of thanks from the Department of Health, old photographs with colleagues and patients, and an old, faded name badge. Margaret Wilson, Head of Pediatric Surgery, Manchester Royal Infirmary. She took it in her hand. It seemed heavier than it actually was. She ran her finger over the faded photograph, which showed her younger, beautiful, confident, and felt something turn over inside her. She had thought she had buried this past, forgotten it. She had thought she had left it forever. But it turned out that some things stay with you forever, and some deaths never expire, even if you try to run away from them. In the 20 years she had spent in voluntary isolation, Margaret Wilson had become a quiet, inconspicuous, almost invisible old woman, whom the neighbors considered strange, eccentric, and unsociable. She did not greet people first, did not attend residence meetings, did not gossip on the stairwell like the other women. Once a month, a social worker would come, young and indifferent, to check if she was still alive, and would leave again without asking unnecessary questions. Margaret would open the door, say, "Everything's fine, thank you," and close it. That was enough. That was enough to feel safe. That was enough to hide from the world, from people, from herself. But in reality, she was not hiding from people. She was hiding from herself. From the Margaret she had once been, strong, brave, unbending, ready to fight to the end. From the one who could have saved, but had not. From the one who had left because she could not bear it any longer, because she had broken under the weight of her own helplessness. She had buried her soul in this small, dark flat, shut herself off from everyone, and convinced herself that she could change nothing, that the world was imperfect and she was too old and weak to fight. She looked at her cactus on the windowsill, its spines reflecting the light of the street lamp, and thought that this prickly, lonely flower was the only living creature she had left. She had even given it a name, Cactus, and she talked to it when she felt particularly lonely. But now, looking at the old name badge in her trembling hands, she understood. All this time she had simply been waiting. Waiting for the moment when she could be useful again. Waiting for someone to call her for help. Waiting for the world to remind her who she really was. And that moment had come. It had come in the form of a scream that woke her this morning, in the form of a small defenseless body on the cold concrete floor, in the form of a boy's eyes that begged for help, but were afraid to speak it aloud. She could no longer remain in the shadows. She could no longer be a silent witness. An hour later, Margaret was already going down the stairs, leaning heavily on her old stick. She had put on her only decent coat, grey, with worn cuffs and a faded collar, but clean and carefully ironed, which she wore only on special occasions. On her feet she wore old but comfortable leather shoes, bought 10 years ago and still serving her faithfully. In her handbag she had her ID card, her notebook, and the old name badge, which she had slipped into the inside pocket at the last moment, feeling that it gave her confidence. On the second floor, she was intercepted by Helen. She was standing at her half-open door, clearly waiting for her, like an experienced hunter lying in wait for its prey. Her eyes glittered with curiosity, and she could barely suppress a smile. "Margaret, where are you off to so early in the morning?" She sang in a sweet, saccharine voice that grated on the ear. "Usually at this time you're having tea by the window. Has something happened? Do you need any help?" "I have things to do," Margaret replied briefly, trying to pass by. But Helen did not give way, blocking the passage with her heavy body.
What kind of things? She persisted. We are all upset about the little boy from the fourth floor. The ambulance came, the police were here. Apparently, he fell out of bed. Poor Catherine, so young, alone with a child. And you, I heard, were barking orders like a general on the battlefield. Where do you know all this from? About the pulse, the pupils, all those medical things. We were all amazed. Margaret stopped on a step that was slightly higher than the one Helen was standing on and looked down at the neighbor. There was so much cold, icy, steely determination in her eyes that Helen involuntarily stepped back, pressing her back against the wall. Helen, Margaret said calmly, but with a metallic edge in her voice. You worked for 30 years as a cleaner in a school. You know how to mop floors and dust. I worked for 30 years as a surgeon in a children's hospital. I know how to save lives, sew up wounds, and stop bleeding. And I know what child abuse looks like. I've seen it hundreds of times. So be so kind as to let me pass. I don't have time for your gossip right now. She did not wait for an answer. She pushed the stunned Helen aside with her shoulder and stepped heavily down into the cool grey courtyard. Outside, a fine, annoying, penetrating drizzle was falling, soaking to the bone. Margaret pulled up her hood and headed for the bus stop on the other side of the street. The journey to the hospital took almost an hour. She stood at the window, not daring to sit down, because she knew that once she sat down, it would be hard to get up again. She looked at the city, which had changed beyond recognition over the years. New houses, glass and concrete, had grown up in place of old buildings. New signs, new shops, new people. Only the hospitals remained the same. Grey, peeling buildings, built in the last century, eternal queues at reception, where people stood for hours, and the ubiquitous, acrid smell of chlorine and medicine, which mixed with the smell of fear and pain. Manchester Royal Infirmary was not her old hospital, but it was built just like all the hospitals in this city. The accident and emergency department to the left of the main entrance, the children's ward on the third floor, the intensive care unit on the fourth. Margaret entered the building, and the familiar, painfully familiar hospital noise hit her. Voices, footsteps, the clinking of drips, the crying of children. She went to the reception desk, behind which sat a young nurse with an indifferent face. I need the head of pediatric surgery, Margaret said firmly. David Thompson, is he here? Who are you? The nurse asked, not looking up from her computer screen. Margaret silently pulled her old name badge out of her pocket and placed it on the counter in front of the nurse. The badge was old, faded, but the inscription was still legible. The nurse looked up, looked at the badge, then at Margaret, and something in her face changed. Surprise gave way to respect. You are from the infirmary? She asked with evident timidity in her voice. I've heard of you. The doctors talk about you. You are that famous Margaret Wilson who... I was a long time ago, Margaret interrupted. I'm waiting for David Thompson. Tell him I'm here. She stepped back from the counter and sat down on a hard, uncomfortable plastic bench against the wall, placing her stick beside her. She waited. The corridor was full of people. A woman with a crying child in her arms went by, the child's arm covered in plaster. Behind her hurried a man with a briefcase full of documents, talking on his phone as he walked. Nurses were running around with drips and test results. Margaret watched them and felt all habits returning, the professional mode activating, which she had thought was extinguished forever. She saw the pain again, heard the crying of children, smelled the smell of the hospital. It was like coming home, to a place she had left many years ago, but which had always been part of her soul. After 20 minutes, which seemed like an eternity, a tall figure in a white coat appeared at the end of the corridor. David Thompson. He had aged a great deal over the years. His hair, once jet black, was now completely grey. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his eyes, once full of youthful optimism, were now tired, wise, and somewhat dimmed. But he walked quickly, decisively, and when he saw Margaret sitting on the bench, he stopped in his tracks. On his face were reflected astonishment, then joy, and then deep, sincere gratitude. "Margaret," he said, and there was so much warmth, so much respect in his voice, that she almost burst into tears. "My God, how glad I am to see you. I thought I'd never see you again." She stood up, her legs numb from the uncomfortable bench, and she had to lean on her stick. "Hello, David. Thank you for agreeing to see me." He stepped towards her and embraced her, without regard for the passers-by, firmly, in a friendly manner. "I thought you'd moved away," he said, pulling back. "I called you several times, but your phone was off. I even looked for you through social services, but they said you didn't want any contact." "I changed my flat, then my number," she replied. "It's a long and not very interesting story. Let's not waste time on the past. Where's the boy? What's happened to him?" David took her arm and led her to the lift, which opened its doors with a groan. "Third floor, room 12, he said as they entered. "Moderate concussion, contusion of the soft tissues of the head, a large hematoma on the temple. It could have been a basal skull fracture, but fortunately it didn't come to that. He was lucky that help came so quickly. Your intervention, Margaret, saved his life. If you hadn't applied the ice and stabilized his condition before the ambulance arrived, the consequences could have been catastrophic." "He was lucky," Margaret repeated, and there was no joy in her voice. "He's alive, and that's the main thing. What else did you notice? Did you examine him completely?" They left the lift on the third floor. David looked around and lowered his voice. "I examined him completely," he said, and his voice became serious and concerned. On his back, 2 old bruises of different ages, 1 week and 2 weeks old. On his thigh, a scar that looks like a burn from an iron or a hot object. On his wrists, all scratches that, according to the mother, happened when he fell off a swing a few weeks ago. I don't believe her. Margaret, this is not the first time. This is systematic abuse." Margaret stopped, leaning on her stick. "Have you reported it? To social services? To the police?" David shook his head. "Not yet. I don't have hard evidence. The mother says he fell off the swing, burned himself by accident. She's very convincing. If I report it without evidence, it'll just be a checkup, an empty conversation, a warning. And in a month, they'll bring him in again. Or they won't, because it'll be too late. You know the system, Margaret. We both know how it works." Margaret nodded. She knew it. She knew this system from the inside, with all its flaws, bureaucratic delays, and formalities. She knew that to save a child, you needed not just suspicions, but facts, documents, witnesses. But she also knew that if they waited, it might be too late. "I want to see him," she said. David nodded and led her down the corridor. They approached room 12. Through the glass pane in the wooden door, Margaret saw James. He was lying on the bed by the window, his head wrapped in a white bandage that contrasted with his pale, almost translucent skin. His eyes were closed, and he seemed even smaller and more vulnerable than yesterday, when she had seen him on the stairs. Next to him, on an uncomfortable plastic chair, sat a hunched old woman in an old, faded headscarf. She held his small, thin hand in her wrinkled hands and whispered something softly, monotonously, like a prayer. "That's his grandmother," David said. "Mary. She came an hour ago from the outskirts of Manchester. The mother hasn't appeared. I've called her several times, but she won't pick up." "I see," said Margaret, and without asking permission, she pushed the door open and entered the room. The woman looked up when she heard footsteps. She had a tired, gaunt face, deep wrinkles around her eyes, red, swollen eyelids from crying. "Are you the doctor?" she asked hopefully, her weak, trembling voice. "I used to be a doctor," Margaret replied, coming closer. "My name is Margaret Wilson. I'm your neighbor. I live 1 floor up, in the same stairwell." The woman blinked, trying to understand. Neighbor? I don't know you. I'm rarely in the city, only when Catherine calls. I rarely leave the house either, Margaret said. But this morning I saw your grandson being carried out of the flat on a stretcher. What happened to him? Please tell me everything you know. Mary, James's grandmother, burst into tears again, quietly, soundlessly, wiping her eyes with the corner of her handkerchief. I told Catherine, she whispered through her sobs. I told her 100 times, you can't treat a child like that. But she doesn't listen. She says I'm old and don't understand anything. She says I'm interfering in things that aren't my business. And this... She could not go on, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Margaret sat down on the edge of the neighboring empty bed and placed her hand on Mary's shoulder. Mary, I know how hard this is for you, but I need to know the truth. This man who lives with them, his name is Andrew, isn't it? What does he do? Mary raised her tear-stained face to Margaret. He beats James, she said, her voice trembling. He beats him for every little thing. For a broken cup, for laughing too loudly, for not doing what he's told. He beats Catherine too, when she tries to defend her son. I've seen bruises on her arms, on her face. She says she fell, but I know the truth. I know what he does. And James, he's so small, so thin. He doesn't even cry when he's beaten. He just freezes and waits for it to be over. He's afraid that if he cries, he'll be beaten even harder. 2 weeks ago I came to take him to my place for the weekend. Andrew wouldn't allow it. He said you don't spoil a child. And when I tried to insist, he threatened to break my arms so I'd never see my grandson again. He said he had connections with the police, that he'd get away with anything. Margaret listened without interrupting. Every word from Mary, every fact, every description of cruelty pierced her like needles. She clenched her fists so hard that her nails dug deep, painful marks into her palms. Mary, she said, when the grandmother fell silent, what you've just told me is not a family matter. It's not tough love. It's a crime against a child. And if we do nothing, if we stay silent, your grandson might not survive next time. Do you understand that? Mary froze, looking at Margaret with fear and disbelief. But what can I do? She whispered. I'm alone. I'm old. I don't have the strength. Andrew is strong, evil. He's not afraid of me. He'll take revenge, and then it'll be even worse for James and Catherine. I can't take that risk. You're not alone, Margaret said firmly. I'm with you, and I won't let him hurt your grandson. We'll find a way. We'll gather evidence, find witnesses, go to the police. But I need to know, if I start this case, if I make a noise, will you be ready to confirm your words officially? Mary was silent for a long time. She looked at the sleeping James, at his pale, emaciated face, at his small, thin fingers, which even in sleep were clutching the edge of the sheet. And then she nodded slowly, but decisively. Yes, she said, I'll do it. For him. For my grandson. I'm ready. Margaret squeezed her hand. Thank you, Mary. We'll get through this together. As Margaret left the hospital, she felt a fire kindling within her. It was not just anger, it was determination. She knew she needed more evidence. The grandmother's testimony alone was not enough. She might be scared and withdraw. She needed someone who had seen the violence with their own eyes, who could confirm all the facts. And Margaret knew who to turn to. The next day, as she was leaving her building, she saw a young woman standing by the door, a cup of coffee in her hand, clearly waiting for her. The woman was about 25, with short, stylish hair, wearing jeans and a leather jacket. She looked confident and determined. "Are you Margaret Wilson?" she asked as Margaret approached. Margaret looked at her suspiciously. "Yes," And who are you? My name is Laura, the woman said. I live in flat 41, right opposite Catherine. I saw what happened yesterday morning. I heard you giving orders, and I want to help. In case you haven't realized, I'm ready to give a statement. Margaret looked at her intently. In the girl's eyes, there was no fear, only determination and a deep personal pain that she carefully concealed. Why do you want to help? Margaret asked. Laura sighed, took a sip of coffee, and looked away. Because I know what it's like when no one comes to help, she said. I come from a family like that myself. I know what bruises that don't go away are like, and the fear that doesn't go away. My father was just like Andrew. He beat my mother. He beat me. I grew up in that hell, and I swore to myself that when I grew up, I would never keep quiet when I saw injustice. When I saw James on the floor, I knew I couldn't keep quiet. I wouldn't let another child go through what I went through. Margaret felt her heart tighten. Thank you, Laura, she said. Your help is invaluable. But you have to understand, Andrew is dangerous. If he finds out you've testified against him, he'll take revenge. Are you prepared for that? Laura looked Margaret straight in the eyes. I'm ready. I'm not afraid of him. I'm not afraid of anyone anymore. I've been through hell and I've survived. I won't let him destroy another life. They went up to Laura's flat. It was a small but cozy one-bedroom flat with a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Laura asked Margaret to sit on the sofa and began her story. I've been living here for a year and a half, she began. When I moved in, everything was fine. Andrew seemed like a nice guy, hardworking, always smiled, said hello. Catherine seemed happy. James was cheerful, ran around the yard, played with the other children. And then something changed. About 8 months ago, Andrew started drinking, a lot and often. He became angry, irritable. I often heard his shouts at night, a child crying, the sounds of blows. I knocked on the wall, but it didn't help. Once I called the police, but they came, talked to Andrew, and he said everything was fine. It was just a family argument. They left, and that same evening, I heard Andrew threatening Catherine that if she ever called anyone again, he would kill her and her son. Margaret listened, holding her breath. Tell me about the balcony, she said. Did you see anything? Laura went pale. That was 3 weeks ago, she said. I couldn't sleep, so I went to the kitchen to get some water. The kitchen window looks out onto the yard, and I saw their balcony. Andrew was standing on the balcony, holding James by the hand. James was only wearing his pants, barefoot. It was very cold outside. It was already October, maybe 5 degrees above zero. Andrew was holding him over the railing and saying something. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see his face. He was furious. And James, he wasn't crying. He wasn't moving at all, like a rag doll. He was just hanging in the air, and I was afraid that Andrew would let go and he would fall. It lasted for a minute or two, and then Andrew pulled him back inside. I didn't sleep a wink all night. I wanted to call the police, but I was scared. I was scared that Andrew would find out it was me, and that he'd come to me. I heard him on the phone, and he said that if anyone else stuck their nose in his business, he'd break their legs. I was afraid. I'm a coward, forgive me. Laura covered her face with her hands. Margaret went over to her and put her hand on Laura's shoulder. Laura, you're not a coward, she said firmly. You witnessed a terrible event, and your reaction was normal. But now you're here, telling me about it, and that makes you a hero. Your testimony could be decisive. Are you ready to repeat that in court? Laura looked up, her eyes glistening with tears, but there was determination in them. Yes, she said. I'm ready. I'll do it for James. The process of gathering evidence took several weeks. Margaret worked like a prosecutor. She recorded all the statements, contacted the doctors who had examined James and the social workers. She met with David, who provided the medical report that confirmed the systematic abuse.
She found another witness, a neighbor who had seen Andrew dragging James up the stairs by his hair. She convinced Catherine to testify against Andrew, explaining to her that it was the only way to protect her son. Catherine resisted for a long time, cried, was afraid that Andrew would kill her, but finally agreed. The trial took place in early December, when the first snow had covered the city with a white blanket. Margaret arrived at the courthouse an hour before the start, in her only decent coat, with the name badge in her pocket. She felt confident, although inside she was trembling. At the entrance, she was met by Laura and Mary. They hugged, feeling the mutual support. The courtroom was full of people, journalists, neighbors, even Helen had come to gope at the scandal. When Andrew was led in under guard, Margaret felt a cold shiver run down her spine. He had changed during his time in custody, thinner, gaunter, his eyes were more sunken, and his former self-confidence had vanished. But Margaret knew he was still dangerous. He looked at her, and there was hatred in his gaze. The trial lasted several days. The judge, an older woman with a tired face but a sharp, penetrating gaze, listened to all the witnesses. Margaret gave the closing speech, in which she spoke of 20 years of working with children who had been victims of abuse, and of how important it is not to stay silent. Her voice was calm, but there was so much power in it that the courtroom held its breath. When the judge pronounced the sentence, 4 years and 6 months in prison for systematic mistreatment of a minor, Margaret felt a huge weight lift from her shoulders. She watched as Andrew was led away, and there was no joy in her heart, only relief. She had won this battle, but she knew the war was not over yet. A few days after the trial, Margaret went to the women's refuge where Catherine, James, and Mary were living. It was an old, cozy house in a small town outside Manchester, surrounded by pine trees. Inside it was clean, warm, and smelled of home-baked bread. James met her at the door, smiling. There was no more fear in his eyes. "Auntie Margaret!" he cried and ran to her. She hugged him and felt tears rolling down her cheeks. They were tears of happiness. They sat at the table, and James showed her his drawings. One of them showed his family, him, his mother, his grandmother, and a big dog. "And where's Andrew?" Margaret asked. "He's not coming back," James said seriously. "He's in prison. He'll never hurt us again." Margaret hugged him again. "You're right, my dear. Never again." As it grew dark, Margaret began to get ready to go home. Catherine came to her, and her eyes glistened with tears. "Thank you," she said. "If it hadn't been for you, I would never have dared. I would have lived in fear, and my son—" "Don't," Margaret interrupted her. "You took that step yourself. You saved your son, and yourself. I was just there with you. Now you're free, Catherine. Live and enjoy life." Margaret rode home on the empty bus, watching the city lights flashing past the window. She felt an incredible tiredness, but it was a good tiredness, the tiredness of a winner. She knew that this story had changed not only the lives of James and Catherine, but also her own. She had become again the Margaret she had been 20 years ago, strong, brave, ready to fight. She had understood that it is never too late to return to yourself, and that even one small spark can kindle a whole fire of hope. When the bus stopped outside her house, she stepped out onto the snowy street. On the bench by the entrance sat a young woman with a baby in her arms. The woman was freezing, with a tear-streaked face and a fresh bruise on her cheek. "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked. The woman looked up at her with frightened eyes. "My husband threw me out," she whispered. "He said I shouldn't come back. I've nowhere to go." Margaret looked at her, at the child, at the snowy courtyard, and understood that her story was not over. "Come with me," she said. "Come up to my flat. You can warm up, feed the baby,
and tomorrow we'll figure something out. Together. They went up to the 5th floor. Margaret opened the door and let the guests in. On the windowsill stood the old cactus, and in the corner lay a chessboard. Margaret put the kettle on, and in the flat that had been empty and silent for 20 years, for the first time in a long time, a child's voice was heard. Margaret smiled. She knew her story was not over yet, and that she could still be needed, important and useful to someone. My dear friends, this long, difficult story has come to an end. I believe it has touched the most delicate strings of your souls and reminded you that hope never dies as long as there are people willing to fight for justice. I would very much like to know what you think about this story. Have there been moments in your life when you, like Margaret, realized that you could no longer stay silent? Or maybe you were in Catherine's situation and found the strength to change your life and take a step towards freedom. Or have you encountered injustice and decided not to look away, like Laura, and lent a hand to someone who needed help? Please write your stories in the comments. Let this post become a place of strength where everyone can find support and inspiration. Let's create a community of people who do not stay silent, who see pain and do not turn away. Your experiences, your words, could be the light at the end of the tunnel for someone who is desperately looking for a way out. And of course, don't forget to write which city you are from. It matters so much to me to know who is with me today. Your presence is the greatest reward for me. Thank you for being here. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so that as many people as possible can see it. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss new stories, just as honest and moving. We will meet again, and I promise to continue to surprise you with new, deep, moving tales about life, love, pain, and hope. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Remember, even in the darkest times, when it seems there is no way out, there is always someone ready to reach out a helping hand. Sometimes that person is you. Thank you for being with me. See you in the next episodes.